Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
I'm Dr. Monica Sandler. I'm media historian in the Department of Media Studies at Ball State University.
wonderful.
Hello.
And Ball State, if I'm not mistaken, has the archives of Norman Angell, one of the most popular nonfiction writers of the interwar period, who kind of founded a peace movement, right?
Yes, I believe so. We've got there's surprising amount of things in Ball State. We've got them. We've got lots of David Letterman related things. All of that.
He's from
So
Indiana,
small
isn't
world.
he? David Letterman's
Yes,
from Indiana.
he
So does that
went
mean
to
you
Ball
have
State.
clippings from his late latter-day beards and things like that?
He does a big event every year, which is coming up pretty soon. So he comes back and supports the university, which is really lovely.
So he's an alum of Ball State.
Yes.
Ah, great. Well, good on him for all his foibles and for that terrible beard.
Yes, he gives generously to the university, so
Okay,
thumbs
right.
up.
So, right, our friend,
Yes,
despite, shall we say,
yes.
some things he definitely did and may or may not have done. Well, Prof, I wanted to ask you as an opening gambit, now that I've put you on the spot about David Letterman's beard clippings and Norman Angel's papers. My father wrote a book about Norman Angel and spent a lot of time at Ball State going through
Mhm.
those archives.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So Muncie, exciting place.
The thing I always ask people is what's currently impeding, preoccupying, interesting, dynamizing them. What's going on, Prof, for you?
So I'm not gonna lie, I'm very preoccupied with the award season as it's unfolding currently. I write about the history of the Academy Awards, but the idea for the book just came from just kind of a lifelong obsession with following the award season every year. That's basically just like from November when the awards films start to get released more mainly, or like when film festival season starts. Basically, all I talk about is the awards race, or at least like since I was very, very young, like shockingly, like around 11, 12, 13, that kind of thing. So the tradition continues.
Well, it was on in prime time when prime time meant something for 11
Yes,
o'clock years.
yes. Back when lots and lots of people watched the Academy Awards ceremony, I would be kind of glued to my television set yelling at my parents about disagreeing with what won or something like that.
Now, and did they let you stay up till the very end?
I I remember staying up for most of it. We were in California, so where I'm from, so I don't
Ah,
think that was
makes a
ever
big
really an
difference.
issue.
Yeah, big
Yeah,
difference.
we were done by 8, even if they went insanely long.
Yeah. Um, Now, Prof, I don't know whether you follow what goes on at the BAFTAs, the sort of
Hmm.
British equivalent, but you may have seen that in the last couple of days, there's been
Yes.
huge controversy over
Hmm.
racist speech by somebody with Asperger's who has
Tourette syndrome.
no, pardon? Sorry, did I say Asperger's?
Tourette syndrome.
Sorry, has
Yes.
Tourette syndrome. My apologies to him, to you, to everybody who has Tourette's. And my apologies to people with different forms of um, neurological variation, diversity, and so on. And this has become very interesting because it's one of these cases where the speech itself is sort of excused by people for intersectional reasons because
Hmm.
he's not in control of his language. And I've certainly known people with Tourette's of whom that was true.
Hmm.
But rather the sort of cover up by
Hmm.
the BBC and by the BAFTA organizers themselves in failing in a straightforward way, A, to make sure these off-scene remarks were not heard, but B, to accept that this is unacceptable and apologize wholeheartedly. Now, does that
Yeah.
make a big splash at the moment in the US, or because it's the BAFTAs, it doesn't matter?
It's everywhere. I mean, especially happening with the cast of Sinners speaking, where the individual Tourette's syndrome shouted in a racial slur that's highly inappropriate.
Yeah.
And I think
Mm.
there was a really great post by April Rain, who's the originator of the Oscar So White tweet, is an activist, but she has her own Substack, and she actually spoke specifically to this, saying, that really what this showcased was the kind of institutional failings between BBC, who did not edit out the moment from the ceremony. They did, because there was a 2 hour delay between when the
It's not as though it's
actual
a seven
ceremony took
second,
place.
it's not as though it's a 7 second delay.
Yeah, exactly. There was a 2 hour delay. They cut moments of like someone saying Free Palestine in their acceptance speech, but they kept in the moment with the Tourette syndrome. And you, no one really, there hasn't been a really clear disclosure of why that decision was made. But one thing that Rain really talked about was this sort of institutional failings that, did not give the proper disclaimers and did not choose to, you know, if it were running in America, that would have been muted no matter what,
Well, they
because
said
of the
we
second
were in a
delay.
truck.
Yeah.
I love this idea. If I'm in a
Mhm,
truck, I could kill 1 million people because, come on, I'm in a truck. Get over it.
mhm.
I mean, totally bizarre.
Yeah, so absolutely bizarre, shocking, and I mean, I think it was hurt. It's a situation that is incredibly complicated just in terms of, the hurtful language and the effect that that has on people hearing those words. And then also, the uncontrollability of someone with Tourette syndrome and the struggle that the person with Tourette syndrome is going through.
Yeah.
And that, like, that's a really huge challenge. But there's also, institutionally, like, what does it mean that, the person was seated somewhere where the language could be heard by and be picked up from microphones? Like, he could have been seated somewhere further back or where that wouldn't have been an issue. And I know certainly, like, he left early, which means that he himself experienced a lot of embarrassment from the whole incident, and he's just living with disability. And then, the experience of it being on television, the reaction of it all happening, like, there are so many institutional failings that occurred from BAFTA and from the BBC that aired
Um,
it. And that was one of the things, like, I highly recommend people looking at April Rain's Substack because her
Thank
posts
you. I
are
didn't
really
know about that. And there was also
yeah,
the apology with the terrible tagline from the compere. We apologize if anybody was offended, if
yeah,
anybody could. This is the weasel word Hollywood apology for everything. Instead
mhm,
of I did the wrong thing, I'm sorry. It's if you were offended, I'm sorry.
yeah,
It's appalling language.
yeah.
I mean, really
Yeah,
shocking.
absolutely. I mean, and it's just one of those, like, even supporting people with Tourette's, like, that is, if it's going to be airing on national television, like, there are certain things that, like, you would bleep or you would expect. And for that type of, like, I'm not taking responsibility in the moment. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't necessarily, like, fault Alan Cumming for, like, he was someone who said that at the ceremony,
yeah.
because I think he was just reacting in the moment and this wasn't really anything that he was in charge of. But just being put in that position of, like, this is what I've been told to say by the higher ups who are dealing with a
True.
bad
But
situation now.
he's a very smart guy and very culturally sensitive. He should have left out if this offended anybody.
I suppose that is true, yes.
I'm in the same way I shouldn't have said Asperger's when it's somebody with Tourette's.
Mhm.
You've got to apologize because it's a mistake,
Yes.
not a
Yeah,
furious. You know
that
what?
is very, very true. And there was a not taking responsibility in the moment that really should have been taken in by everyone involved in the ceremony.
Now, going back in history, Prof, I can remember Marlon Brando refusing
Yes.
the Best Actor award, the things with
Hmm.
the ceremony after The Godfather, and instead having a spokesperson, a Native American woman, read out a statement about the oppression of Native Americans. And I'm wondering how far back this issue of cultural politics goes in the Academy
Hmm.
Awards.
Mhm. Well, certainly, I mean, the incident with Sashi and Littlefeather has so many dimensions to it as well, because there are later in life, like, have been questions about whether or not she was of indigenous descent. And then that doesn't disavow then the sort of shocking and disgusting response and the booing that came from people in the audience. I mean, that was one of the first times where you saw kind of a political statement in an acceptance speech. And that certainly became much more common as the ceremony continued, but some of like the issues of kind of cultural politics, issues of race and representation at the ceremony. I mean, this goes back to like within the first decade of the ceremony, it was sort of intricately tied to the development of like the awards as a tool for individuals in the workforce and who's being excluded from those opportunities in the industry.
You've written very powerfully about the importance of the spectacle of the early Academy Awards in the process of unionization within the motion picture industry. Can you take us back, as they say in baseball, to the 30s and Frank Capra, everybody's hero?
Frank Capra, I don't know if he should be everyone's hero. I mean, I find him fascinating, but not necessarily. When things really served Frank Capra's interests, he was shockingly and powerfully effective, and that's been kind of my experience of
Yeah.
him. But he was president of the Academy from 1935 to 1939, which was in the heart of the unionization movement in Hollywood. And also during this period, like the Academy is the most hated organization in Hollywood during his presidency, kind of ironically. And he specifically pulls the Academy out of what had been a really problematic position as kind of a fake union in the industry and turned it into the type of prestige organization that we think of out today. I mean, I'll walk you through some of that immediately, but the simplest thing of like, why are the Oscars a big thing? Like Frank Capra ardently believed in the Academy Awards, and we could talk about why that's a problem, but he saw it as something that could help build a legacy. And like in the midst of, this award that is really about celebrating individual achievement in the collective medium, like this is one of the things like he is like full stop, like this is an important thing, this is the best thing that has come out of this organization, and the awards are really, really important. But I'll go back to the very, very beginning. I think that's to talk about the labor issue. So the Academy, when it's founded in 1927, is like there are several reasons for its founding, but the biggest issue is essentially to be a fake union, or a kind of a variation of a company union that existed as a labor structure in Hollywood. Essentially, what that meant was that they were a bargaining body that was designed basically where everyone could sit in a room and have representatives from different fields of the industry. They could negotiate with producers, but they didn't have any legally binding contracts that would then force producers to comply. They're kind of living in this faith-based system. But this is basically created as an alternative to unionization in 1927 after most of the creative labor, or the lower division workforce successfully unionizes into IATSE. There is a movement from Actors Equity, the theatrical union, to join to unionize actors in Hollywood. And so this is a like, we really don't want this to happen thing amongst the producers. So the Academy is formed kind of on the basis of that, of being a negotiation space without all of those pesky labor rights associated with them. They work as a tool essentially until 1933, which is when the Academy basically they attempt to implement a pay cut. The studio executives, those who were organized into IATSE, had the contractual bind, were not allowed to permitted to take the pay cut. And then those who were in the Academy didn't have anything legally binding with their standard wages, so they took a pay cut. Within weeks, the Screen Actors Guild and the Screenwriters Guild form, and within about a year, the Directors Guild forms after that. So the Oscars start in the context of that. And I think that's a really important part. And that's like really what I've written about when I've talked about the connection between labor. There's a quote that I have kind of from memory because it's so glued into my brain, where Louis B. Mayer, who's one of the originators of the Academy, says, "I found the best way to handle workers was to hang medals all over them. If it gave them trophies, they do whatever they wanted." And then at the end of it is like, and that's why the Academy Award was invented, because he just says the quiet part out loud. So I think that really kind of gives a baseline about this issue of labor in the industry. And we can also debate whether or not that was worth saving, the way Frank Capra fought really hard to do so later on.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's a bit like the US military, which gives medals for wiping your bottom in the correct direction.
Yeah,
Virtually everything, right? I mean, it's astonishing compared to most other militaries, I think. But it is really interesting. He's famous, Louis B. Mayer, for coming up with pithy remarks. and I've heard
Yeah.
most of them. I must admit, I hadn't heard that one before.
Mhm.
And it
I,
is great. And of course, one of the prevailing myths about why they left the Lower East Side for Hollywood was 300 days of sunshine a year, but it was also what we
mhm.
now call a right to work state. They wanted to
Yes.
get away from their fellow Jewish Russians on the Lower East Side, who, unlike these guys, were socialists and wanted
Mhm.
unions, right? I mean, that was a big
Mhm.
part of
Yeah.
the shift, you know?
Yeah, there were a few labor standards in place in California, and that was a huge selling point. Yes. But IATSE got in there and managed to organize most of the workforce. But the high paid people, like if they could avoid it, they tried as hard as they could. Uh, and that's the Academy, 99 years old this year.
And one of the other big events you write about, very related to Oscars so white, Hollywood so white, is in one of your articles, maybe more than one, Hattie McDaniel winning
Mhm.
Best Supporting Actress, as it was called, in
Mhm.
1939 for the racial epic Gone with the Wind. Could you tell
Yes.
us a wee bit about that? Because apart from anything else, she's just about, I think, the only person of color in the theater at the time, I mean,
Mhm.
physically present. And there's great controversy from white people and African American people over
Mhm.
this nomination and success.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there are so many layers to what's going on. The first thing that can be noted is that Hattie McDaniel won her Academy Award in a segregated ceremony. So she originally was not permitted to attend because it was at that time it was held as a banquet at the Coconut Grove. They different locations because the Biltmore being another one of their common locations, the Roosevelt Hotel. Um, but it was held at the Coconut Grove, which had a strict whites only policy, so they had to get special permission even to have her present
Oh, I
at
didn't
the
know
ceremony.
that. My God.
Yeah.
Mm.
And then she was segregated off to into the corner when she won her award. So there's that's sort of always present about, just what was the nature of her victory. Like there was all of that kind of symbolizing what's going on in Hollywood at the time. The Coconut Grove being one of the most popular kind of hangouts of the era. Um, so her victory is what I find really interesting about it. I mean, there's so many elements to it, but that the cultural commentary, like so much of that moment is not even about her. It's about this sort of wider symbolism of the award. And like there's a divide. There's some terrible articles, particularly like in predominantly white news outlets that are like, this is a symbol of like, a blow to Hitlerism. And like, this showcases that America is the great ideal and like, barriers broken. And like, let's just not even think about what is it Gone with the Wind and all of that stuff. So this was this sort of mythologization of like Hollywood just showed how not racist America is and how not racist Hollywood is, which is insane given the context of just the movie and so many other things going on at the time. So it becomes this symbol that I think is so often kind of gone to was like, well, Hollywood gave Hattie McDaniel an Academy Award in 1940. Like that, there are moments where Hollywood likes to disavow its own systemic racism and that there are these things that get drawn towards. And I think this is the sort of symbolism that's really dangerous about the Oscars is that it can feel like something concrete, even though it really didn't symbolize anything. She was celebrated at a segregated ceremony. Um, the other thing that I think is really that I think is really notable in the discussions about the aftermath of Hattie McDaniel's victory was that in Black press there was also a divide about this. Sort of universally, the a lot of the read was she brought humanity to a really really racist stereotype role, and like there's something worthy of like commending her for her talent. But the fact that this is what's being offered and that this is the type of role that is available to her is, disgusting. And that was something that was sort of always present in a lot of the discussion. And the debate when she won was, is this going to lead to better parts and better pictures? Or are we reinforcing stereotypes? And is this going to encourage them to do more mammy characters because, this is seen as socially acceptable because they celebrate Hattie McDaniel, but they celebrated her playing mammy in Gone with the Wind. And so you see this debate that occurs, and this is one of the things I've written about within Black press about whether or not, like, is this an accomplishment? One of my favorite writers, her name's Lillian Johnson. She was at the Pittsburgh Courier most predominantly, but she specifically is like, this is not okay. Like, this is going to set a standard that, like, we need to be fighting for. The part is just as important as the performance, because if this is what's celebrated, this is what Hollywood will think is good enough, and it's not. Um, and I think I mean, she's an amazing writer, but I think she really should be brought into this conversation because she's so dead on in a lot of her discussions, especially because, you know, the next person to win or not to get an Academy Award non-competitive was for Song of the South in the late 1940s, and, like, again, reinforcing stereotypes. That was with James Baskett, who got an honorary award for his performance in that movie. Another stereotype there. So I think these are important conversations to constantly be having, especially since we continue to talk about things like Oscar So White, or things like BAFTA's So White, also worthy of reckoning, as we really saw this week.
Absolutely. And of course, this also is a microcosm of those debates about talented 10th notions versus a problem with any kind of notion of an elite or oligarchy, be it putatively meritocratic or not, because it still means the vast majority of people are left out of the story. They're certainly left out of the power relations. Going forward a bit chronologically, in terms of what your work covers, you also address one of these periodic crises in Hollywood that comes along, often associated with new technologies, but really much more about prevailing social relations. I'm thinking here of the period after the war, and you must forgive people, for those of my age, the war always means the Second World War. Can't help it. It's the one good thing, in inverted commas, we ever did. And in that period, there's a huge crisis for Hollywood with white suburbanization, because with white suburbanization and televisualization of the United States, which happens very, very quickly, you get a sudden drop off in these record numbers of people going to the movies during the war and right after it. And then there's the baby boom, which also keeps people, especially women, busy at home, as it were. But you also write about this period, 1946 to 1950, as a crucial moment within the studio system. They're also confronting antitrust struggles they've been going through from the late 30s, and then the Paramount decree. So what's going on for the studios at this moment of monumental social and media change?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a number of kind of, I guess would say, like, a couple of key elements that transform the industry that are kind of send it through shockwaves. One of them is the de Havilland decision, which was Olivia de Havilland suing Warner Brothers to get out of her contract, and sort of the ending of 7-year standard contracts. So that kind of freed up a lot of talent, in particular, in the workforce. The other being the Paramount consent decree in 1948, and the impact of that, which is saying that basically that all of the, over time, it led to all of the major studios severing ties from the theatrical chains. This is where Hollywood basically kind of goes into complete and total chaos. But this is where, like, the labor issue comes back up again, and is really, really important. Is that, you know, essentially this is the period of time where Hollywood, those who are working in Hollywood today on film productions, are work as independent contractors, where they're hired job to job and are waiting, kind of, once they finish something, for their next opportunity. This starts in the post-war period, where they move from being studio employees to being independent contractors. There's a period of mass firing that's occurring. This is as kind of the award season is picking up, but one of the things that comes along that I talk about extensively in my work is the rise of awards like the Directors Guild Awards, the Writers Guild Awards, eventually the ACE Eddie Awards, American Cinema Editors, costume designers, which those are in the 1950s, the kind of range of all of these different guild and trade prizes that we see going on right now. The SAG Awards are coming up this weekend, things like that. The SAG Awards came along in the 90s, it should be noted, but, like, the Writers Guild Awards are coming up. The Directors Guild were a couple weeks ago. PGA is coming up. Um, but the baseline of all of these awards start in this period of crisis that essentially, when you're working job to job, opportunities to single out individuals become really, really important because how are you going to ensure that people get their next job? And what's really kind of just there's this selling point that's like kind of brought forward even within some of these associations that becoming independent contractors is going to give you opportunity to have creative control or more creative control over your work, and that this is going to lead to more opportunities for you. And for some people who are kind of the top of the industry, that does create that opportunity where you can choose job to job. For most people, you're just taking on whatever is given to you. But it is true that awards can give you the creative freedom that may not have been possible if you do want to, be focused on your craft. Which is why I think the below the line work categories, some of the ones that we zone out through the ceremony, are some of the most important in terms of what their actual impact is on the workforce. So that's really what like Hollywood Transforms, and award season essentially starts from there because you have the Academy Awards, which are really established at that point, kind of going at the end, and you have the rise of these prizes, and then you have a number of kind of critics group awards that are also existing at that point. And pretty much within the first couple of years of these events coming along, a lot of them are scattered in kind of March and April. They all line up for the Academy Awards. Suddenly there's a lot more public interest in the events because they become predictive, than there were when they were just sort of this random thing. And that in and of itself kind of helps build the zoo of award season that we still have today.
And really what your work shows, I think, amongst many other fascinating things, is that at one level, there is this worker solidarity generated, very important, that Hollywood is a union town. And of course, the de Havilland case and other issues produced the world of the super agent that we have today in sports as well as in Hollywood. We wouldn't have the delightful Wassermans, for example,
Sure. Yes.
without it, but also institutionalizes class, race, and gender hierarchies, as you explain. And later on in your work, as we move into the contemporary era, you write about what happens with race in terms of a film I must admit I failed to watch much of. I was so repulsed by it. Doctor Strange, and whiteness and the inverted commas yellow face of the Marvel universe. Could you tell us a bit about that and the controversy that ensued over the casting in Doctor Strange?
Well, I mean, I think this is something that started to be reckoned with, and I guess this jumps off of awards a little bit, though I do have something I'd like to tie back into at the end, with earlier history. But what particularly happened with the case of something like Doctor Strange, and this really relates to elements of like censorship with China, was that there was this idea that essentially if they wanted their film to play in China, that they would need to like they couldn't talk about Tibet, or they'd have to be very, very selective about how they would actually portray Tibet. So there was this feeling that this character that Tilda Swinton ultimately played was like ingrained in a lot of stereotypes about Asian representation. They didn't want to do that, and then they didn't want to get banned in China for showing a positive Tibetan character. So they instead cast a white woman into this character role, and there's a ton of backlash about like whitewashing the character, the general portrayal of Asian representation being so few and far between, particularly at that point in Marvel. And there being this sort of dynamic about like the cultural politics of censorship that are existing simultaneous to that. And that's really what happens with, eventually, like when they did create Shang-Chi, like it was banned in China because of like depictions and portrayals, even though they're going out of the way. But this is kind of the beholdence of the Chinese market. And I did want to say with, the tie-in to this is some of my work that I've done on comic studies. But with the issue of Asian representation, at the Academy Awards, you had just in terms of opportunity. The second woman of color to ever win at the ceremony was a couple of years ago with Michelle Yeoh, at winning Best Actress for Everything Everywhere All at Once. And she was only the second nominee in Best Actress of Asian descent. This kind of is what I was saying, going back to some of the representation in the 1930s, I think is really important to note, is that the first iteration of this was an actress named Meryl Oberon, who was nominated for Dark Angel in 1935. And Oberon was of Asian descent. She was half Indian, but she was passing in Hollywood. So she told press a story about being from Tasmania and that she was predominantly of British descent. But that centrally, these issues of censorship become really important because at that point in time, she was hiding her Asian identity in order to be able to take on leading roles in Hollywood, because with the production code they had codified miscegenation. So if they have casting, if they're casting someone of Asian descent, they can't cast them opposite to, in that case it was a movie about a love triangle, so two leading male roles would have been unheard of, and it basically codified everyone of color into supporting cast positions. And this is also kind of counterpointed to perhaps the most shameful victory in all of Academy Award history. I'm going that bold, which was in 1937 when Louise, what was her name? I wasn't planning on bringing this one up. Louise, it's for The Good Earth. She won Best Actress. Why is my brain blanking? Because I hadn't realized I was going to go into this. But you had a white woman. Oh, sorry. You were going to add something? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, Prof. Louise Rayner.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I hadn't realized I was going to bring up Louise Rayner in this conversation, but there's much to be said about Louise Rayner. So I just said it was the most shameful victory in all of award history. But Louise Rayner, who won Best Actress for performance in Yellowface for her work in The Good Earth, which came out. And notably, that also gets talked about in kind of awards history, but that was a film, it's sort of been mythologized that um, that it's been mythologized that there were other like Asian actors who'd been up for the role and instead they went with a white woman, which is frankly not true. Um, because they had cast their leading male very, very early in the production of the film. And that basically, once they had cast a white male in the lead, even though he was going to perform in Yellowface, they had to cast a white woman in the role performing in Yellowface because that was what was codified in the production code. So you have these like direct standards in place that are leading to like highly, highly offensive representation kind of across the board. And the kind of end result is Louise Rayner wins Best Actress that year. And there's a great quote from an outlet that literally says, I don't understand how this happens. Like literally all that they're celebrating her for embodying like an Asian woman, and they could have just like cast an Asian woman that really kind of got to the directly to the point. So I mean, even in the moment, it was not necessarily greeted with the same type of problematic like restraint that we have today. But I think it can be looked back on like how does Hollywood do something like that? And all of the policies that were in place that led to a moment like
On that line, well, once we're in the post-production code era, in
mhm,
60s and 70s and 80s, they've got a notion of Pan-Asianism,
yeah,
where anybody of Asian background can play someone from a country that they have no connection to, don't speak the language, don't
yeah,
share the religion, I mean, nothing in
yeah,
common. So they then decide, oh, you're Asian. So you can be Filipina, Japanese, Korean,
mhm,
whatever it might
mhm,
be. So
yeah. Yeah, and I mean those continue to be kind of the stereotypes that get played, or a lack of understanding about different nationalities in the region, kind of always being present. Yeah.
when you talk about Doctor Strange film, one of the things that you and your co-author bring up early on in your article is correspondence between Margaret Cho and Tilda Swinton, initiated by Swinton and
Mhm.
publicized by Cho, in which Cho is very, very angry because Swinton is asking for her approval slash advice instead of educating herself. This, I think,
Mhm.
becomes quite a big issue for a very long time over black-white relations, not just in Hollywood, but in the United States more generally, but also other minorities, by contrast with the discourse and the habitué of white supremacy. And I should say I wouldn't necessarily place Swinton in that because, like Alan Cumming, she's a smart person with normally very sensitive cultural politics. So can you make
Mhm.
sense of this debate between her and Margaret Cho?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think in the moment, it is one of those where you question like why did you walk into this character role in the beginning? And I think some of how it was pitched was that like we're eliminating this cultural stereotype. And I think that like the response from Cho is very much like then like cast an Asian person and like bring them forward into humanity, and like what are you even having this, like how are you asking for permission to do this is kind of what Swinton was doing at the time. And the overall effect and impact of that when you're stepping into a territory that like this is not a story for you to tell, even if Marvel is kind of doing it so that way they can avoid the Chinese, well, problems with the Chinese market or something. Like Swinton as an actress could have said no, and I found it very strange just an actor of her caliber taking on that part, because she is a brilliant actor in a lot of areas, but not necessarily what you saw when you were looking at the performance in that movie, um, in my opinion.
Well, as I say, I didn't make it very far into the film.
It's not the
You,
best.
I've gotten heartily sick of these franchises. I can't
Mhm,
really watch them, and it's not because of any cultural politics reason. I just get bored very, very quickly, I
mhm.
must admit.
They're-
But I think
That's understandable.
this is a very important issue that goes back a very long way. And of course, it also relates to minstrelsy and the prohibition on black performers being
Mhm,
included in all sorts of opportunities in inverted commas
mhm,
that are then
mhm,
taken by white people. It goes back before cinema in the United
mhm,
States, and it just doesn't get any better. You mentioned comics earlier, Prof. Now, I don't have access to all your published work because of where
mhm,
I am, but I know from reading your webpage at the school that you've been involved at the big event in San Diego.
mhm,
So tell us about your comic work before I get on to my next
mhm,
question about
mhm.
Hollywood.
So one of the big things, I mean, I talked a little bit about just like my interest in creative labor, and I'm talking about, how this is an effect in the State of the Academy Awards, and kind of previewing like what is my second book on. It's specifically looking at the comic book industry, or that, um, it's still in development because I am finishing my first book, I should be said right now. But it is in the comic book industry. This is a creative sector that never successfully unionized. So this is a field of industry where people are working job by job, where labor rights have basically been accomplished by like fighting in a very small sector of groups. There are people who are still like there isn't health insurance if you're a regular creator. The working standards are unacceptable, and most of the creators don't own their own IP. So Marvel is making these insane, expensive movies, and those who created all of those characters that they're profiting off of are not getting any of it. Um, and what it means when you have that as an industry. I'm sort of looking at it as a case study and like a horror show of what goes wrong and how terrible it is to being in a field that doesn't have that doesn't have industry rights. So that's really where I've kind of moved to with my interest in comic studies, is this exact issue of what type of opportunity there is, and what goes wrong when there's no union. And I've look at like moments when there were attempts at unionization, and sort of failures that occurred that led to the state of the industry as it currently is today.
Going back to the 30s again, isn't this the time when the guys who create Superman sell the rights to $400?
Yeah, exactly. And there's this isn't known like what this can be, and there isn't like a field existing to kind of guide them.
Yeah, and their names are still known, but there are no residuals as far as I know, not in the way
Yeah,
that there are in many other areas
yeah.
that are unionized. And of course, there's a big threat to that now with AI. And, there are SAG and SAG-AFTRA, I should say, negotiations well in advance of the end of the union contract this year, because they will try to find a way through the artificial intelligence thicket. And what that means, as do the writers, as do other less radical guilds than the writers.
Hmm.
It's a crucial moment. And of course, with many tie-ins to the comic book industry. In fact, if you think back to when the Walt Disney Company was maybe going bust in the 40s,
Hmm.
the way that they got around the strike by union busting and were
Yeah.
given support by the federal government in return for creating, positive images of Latin America. So this racial
Yeah.
issue is so tied into union issues and so tied
Hmm.
to Hollywood's success in ways
Yes.
that I think are often just forgotten. I mean, there are plenty of great scholars who've brought our attention to this, Anna Everett, Jesse Algeron, Reynolds, others. But I think what you're doing is incredibly valuable, incredibly valuable. Um, on now, if I could, to what, in a sense, until the horrors of BAFTA this week, has been perhaps the latest big controversy in award
Hmm.
season, apart from the ongoing controversies about what the Golden Globes are and who votes for them, and the
Uh,
value of promotional baskets given to voters with,
yeah,
cruise
I
ship
mean,
tickets and whatnot.
they're a bottomless pit of corruption. It have pretty
Oh,
much
surely
always
not.
been.
How could you possibly say that, Prof? I'm referring here to trans issues that have become
Yes.
red button ticket items, initially
Hmm.
for progressives and now for the crazy right on the other side
Hmm.
of this. And in particular, you wrote a newspaper column that I read in the Indie Star. This is the first article I've ever read in the Indie Star.
It
Uh,
was also in USA Today. But yes, it was in USA Today as well.
oh, well, I got it in a less well-known place. But, but congrats for publishing in both outlets.
Hmm.
And this is Carla Sofia Gascon in
Hmm.
the recent Oscars. For those who may not remember this or people who are listening way into the future, could you take
Hmm.
us through this controversy, which actually became more controversial after your column appeared, I think?
Hmm. Yes. So, Carla Sofia Gascon was the first trans or openly trans individual nominated for Best Actress. Elliot Page was nominated prior to his transition. So that's always should be noted in this conversation. But Carla Sofia Gascon as a figure, not long after her nomination, there were a series of tweets that were highly offensive, particularly against Muslims. She's a Spanish actress, and she was talking about sort of race in the country, and um, you know, she had posted really disgusting things previously on Twitter, and like that is very, very clear. But one of the things I wrote about particularly in that article was just like, what does it mean, in terms of like an incredibly problematic history of trans representation that has happened at the ceremony. I mean, we're within like 15 years of a cisgender male winning as a trans performer. Um, for was Dallas Buyers Club, which was like 2011, 2012, something along those lines. Um, so there is this history of celebrating like cisgender individuals performing as trans in Hollywood. There have been a number of other nominations. And like, what does it mean to actually give the opportunity for people to tell their own stories on screen? And you had that with something like Carla Sofia Gascon. However, the film itself was Amelia Perez was not the best in terms of its own representation in and of itself, but certainly it is, there has been a movement about, like, should you be giving opportunities to people with disabilities to perform and, just showcase themselves? Should you be given, because there's a long legacy of people performing disability, and there's a long legacy of people who are trans or queer also performing trans or queer identity at the Oscars, and what it means to open that door to people from the actual community to be able to speak to and perform their role. And I think something like Coda a couple of years ago and like the success of several deaf performers at the ceremony after that film also helped to open those doors to those types of conversations. But then you had a figure, and this I think comes up a lot, where there is a lot of complexity to a lot of these issues. Like there's certainly like an excitement about celebrating the first trans performer, but she was, an extremely racist individual. And like, what does that mean? In terms of who we're championing at the ceremony. That was what I raised, in advance of the ceremony as the tweets came out. And this legacy of like, the performance and the performer like are kind of a wider cultural symbol in what they're in what's being elevated, and what it means for like her to have been, well, she wasn't celebrated ultimately. She was not given membership into the Academy this year, which is usually common after a nomination. So certainly she did not receive the kind of ultimate praise once there was more knowledge about who she was as an individual.
There's also an element here, isn't there, of expecting minorities of different kinds to be virtuous, into
Mm-hmm.
correct line politics about absolutely everything. Whereas this
Yes.
has not exactly been an expectation of Gary Cooper, Ronald Reagan, Marilyn Monroe, etc., but on into the
Mm-hmm.
present. Unless you're Mel Gibson,
Mm-hmm.
not much actually holds these people back, regardless of their attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're
Yeah.
a minority of a certain kind, sexual, racial, ability wise, you're suddenly supposed to be holdable, if I can use that expression, to a higher standard all around than
Mm-hmm.
the dominant white figure.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, Carlos Sofia Gascon was flawed, but I think that there's a lot of conversation. What immediately came to my mind when you said that was like, reading Sidney Poitier talking about his career and feeling like he had to be like more than human because that is who he'd be, like the symbol. He knew what his position was and that he represented something so much bigger than himself. But that meant that he couldn't be human and flawed. It felt like a lot of the time. And certainly, like I think he lived up to that, but I think he was also tried to stay out of the limelight at certain moments because he couldn't be a person, given everything that he's was symbolized in the public.
Yeah, and the particular terror in the United States of the figure of the angry black man, which is an
Hmm.
obsession, uh,
Hmm.
going back really from the beginnings of slavery. Um, well, Prof, I had one more question for you, if I may. And when you've answered that, wanted to give you a chance to add anything you wish. And that could
Hmm.
be, as you've already foreshadowed, going back over terrain we've partially covered, or it might be something entirely new. Does that sound all right as a means of bringing things to a close?
Sure.
So my last question is, I imagine this is the time of year when you're taking a lot of phone calls, asking for your
Hmm.
opinions and thoughts, and will after the big event as well. So I'm especially grateful you've made time today during the season to speak with me. What's on the docket at this year's Oscars? What's problematic? What's at issue?
Hmm.
And how much do they matter anymore, given no one watches them except for people who are older than me?
Hmm. Well, and me. So I mean, I think the main thing, the ceremony this year, the BAFTAs on a broad sense kind of threw the race open. So if you do like following the Oscar race, like no one knows who's going to win in the acting categories, could they, well, except for Jessie Buckley, who seems like a major front runner in Best Actress. They had different individuals have won at the BAFTAs, the Critics' Choice Awards, and the Golden Globes so far at the different ceremonies. So the in supporting actress, supporting actor, and then actor, someone who was not nominated for best actor at the Oscars won at the BAFTAs. So there is a huge question mark. So there, if you like following races and like momentum and what's going to win, the races are wide open. For Best Picture, it's kind of a race between two films. And I think something like Sinners would be really, really historic. It received 16 nominations, which is the highest number of nominations in Oscar history. Part of that, it well, obliterated what had previously been 14 nominations, had been several films had tied for, which included Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, La La Land, All About Eve. So really big range of movies there that had received 14 nominations, but they got to 16. There's a new category this year, which is for best casting. So that it was expected that it would break the record, but it blew the record out of the water by getting 2 additional nominations from the record. So certainly, you know, a film like Sinners was an original film made by with a predominantly Black cast. It was hard to get off the ground and showcases how in Hollywood they gave the opportunity for an amazing filmmaker to make a story with minority voices and the success that can come from that. And hopefully that encourages Hollywood to do more of it. So it's not a film like Sinners, it's the range of films like Sinners. But it is kind of opposite One Battle After Another, which is directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, who has never won an Academy Award, it should be noted, despite making a very large range of extremely kind of groundbreaking classic films. There Will Be Blood, The Master, Licorice Pizza. So he's, I think, seen as massively overdue in these conversations. So, you know, there is kind of that's where the race is unfolding, and we're kind of in the middle of things right now. So those are the things I'm really, really monitoring, like where it goes from here. Like the thing I always go back to is that the awards, the labor issue, which is not talked about, and what I really write about in my research, is at the center of this, is that these awards are being given out to people in a field. And even if the Oscars are not watched as much, the role that they're playing in that makes them something that's vital. And that also includes, you know, the all of the awards shows that are going on within the different labor groups and guilds over the course of the since January essentially, and still in the next couple of weeks. But that this award system becomes sort of essential, that it's going to continue to exist. And from that standpoint, you'll simultaneously have, you know, executives and those who are releasing the films or television shows in the case, because most of the guild awards have television categories. They're not just film like the Academy. But that essentially, like, these are tools that exist because they're serving a labor function, but they're then also used to kind of generate profit margins, which I always say reinforces the system of isolation that exists for the labor force, which makes them really complicated in terms of like, are they good, or are they sort of an entrapment of how the industry works and is structured, being individually driven in a collective art form.
That is complicated. It's just as well we have as able a political economist as yourself to make sense of this and to be able to give powerful archival historical perspectives. So, Prof, to conclude, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just that, you know, I think awards, they're the best way I can, even if they're not as popular as they used to be in public discourse, I think they're as essential as they're always going to be to Hollywood. And so long as they're a tool, they'll continue to be kind of thrown at us. And it's about whether or not we keep paying attention. But I think they're kind of a vital resource, and they're just kind of omnipresent is like really where I would close things at, which is why I think they're interesting, even if we can see the facade in front of us fairly easily.
Well, thanks so much. Your work's great, and I've learned a lot from you, not only in terms of your writings, but what you've said to me today.
Thank you for having me.